Hello. So, I'm Rachel, as mentioned, Business Engagement Manager at the University of Manchester. What does that mean? Why am I here? I do have a great interest in sport. As mentioned, I'm a running coach. I've also worked at World Athletics as a timing technician on the side. In terms of business engagement, we connect academic researchers with the world outside. Don't have anything to do with students, people are surprised by that, but at the university we've got academics that are working on or with sports organisations. Blair is an academic in sports at the University of Manchester. We don't have a sports department, but we do have people looking at data and analytics and AI, people looking at crowd control and criminology, people looking at online abuse of athletes, people looking at kit and design and aerospace, aerodynamics engineering. We've got a wind tunnel that British Cycling uses, all kinds of things that mean that we've got a great interest in talking to the sports sector. That's why I'm here anyway. I shouldn't be taking the stage here, should I? I'm going to let my panel take a minute or two each to introduce themselves, starting at the end with Khadija.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Okay. I'm Khadija from Bolton, CEO and founder of KRIMMZ Girls Youth Club, offering a variety of sports for Muslim women and girls. We do get the odd requests from dads and lads as well, which we try to look after. But predominantly Muslim women and girls to get engaging in a variety of sports, giving them opportunities that they wouldn't normally have to do.
Hi everyone, my name's Dr. Blair Hamilton. My pronouns are she, her. I am a sports medicine researcher in the area of transgender physiology in terms of their effects of their hormone treatment on their musculoskeletal health. I also work with UEFA, the governing body for obviously football in Europe, and as part of their expert group on gender eligibility in football. And I'm also work at the Tavistock Gender Identity Clinic in London, so I wear many hats.
Hi, I'm Richard Morris. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Racing Pride, which champions LGBTQ+ inclusion through motorsports and its associated industries. My background is as a racing driver. I started karting when I was a little kid and carried on through to driving single-seaters, prototypes, GT cars. I won a European Championship in prototypes. Not that you have to clap, but you know. And yeah, as I was growing up in the sport, there wasn't much LGBTQ+ representation whatsoever. The sport is very new on that journey. And since Racing Pride was founded in 2019, we've been privileged to work with 5 of the Formula One teams, with some other major companies. I've done a lot of work with Motorsport UK, looking at their inclusion policies as well. I'll talk more about that, as we go through the panel. And the other notable thing about my background, I guess, is before any of that professional driving, as I was a kid, I was also doing another sport. I was doing fencing, the Olympic sport fencing, and I did that up to World Cup level with Great Britain as well. So a little bit of an insight into that sport too, although slightly less current.
Fantastic, thanks everyone. So, we should have a really interesting discussion. If you have read the briefing for this, because I know you've all really read the detail of all the panels, right? The initial scene set was to talk about gender identity and trans inclusion of sport, which is, we're definitely going to cover that and talk quite a lot about it. But when we met last week, we wanted to broaden it out a little bit into inclusivity more broadly. Things like religious and cultural issues, shape and body fit, and how sports have not been inclusive in lots of ways. So as we look to the future of sport and women's sport, we want to, how can we create environments on and off the pitch, or field, or whatever you're playing on, that fully embrace and reflect the diversity of athletes' identities, whatever that may be, to ensure safety, dignity, and opportunity to compete fairly for all. And also at the grassroots level, to get everybody involved in sport and feel that it's something for them. So we're going to talk around 3 sort of broad issues in turn, and then some more general questions that could apply to any or all of those around things like regulation. I do invite you to think about questions, and I will look at the pad for questions as we get towards the end of some of our pre-planned discussion points, so send anything through that occurs to you. So, starting us off, we had a round table last week where we brought in partners, including City Football Club and the other one from down the road, where we talked about issues that sports organisations were interested in, and one that everyone had a real interest in was around kit and fit and body confidence, and how sportswear hasn't necessarily reflected the different body shapes that athletes in different sports have, which can be from skinny, traditional athletic to very bulky and muscly, depending on your sport. And in a team like a rugby team, you've got very different shapes in one team, and one kit doesn't necessarily fit all. And again, there's confidence issues as well as fit and making things real practical. So I'd like to ask my panel how sportswear historically has overlooked the diversity of women's body or different body shapes, and how that's changing today. Have we seen any change yet? Who wants to start?
I'll let you go.
Okay, so I guess I'll go first on this. I've got a couple of thoughts, one of which might almost unhelpfully broaden things out, but there we go. With motorsport, you're thinking about kind of not just the actual kit that you put on yourself, but also your integration into the car. And I think both aspects need thought. So traditionally, motorsport brands have created, understandably, kit for their largest target market, which is cisgender men. The majority of license holders are cisgender men. I'm not telling any secrets in that respect. You know, the vast majority of competitors are male across the sport. Almost every category within the sport is open to all genders, with very limited exceptions, but the reality historically is that's been the case. And so, you know, competition kit manufacturers are obviously commercial brands. They will make things that they think will sell, so they will angle what they make towards men and men's bodies and what men want. The one exception was when Puma worked with W Series, which was an all-women's series on the F1 package for a couple of years. It's now been replaced by F1 Academy. Puma brought out a range of overalls designed specifically for those athletes, looking at things like, you know, different hip dimensions, different elements of tapering, you know, obviously differently shaped sort of busts and things. And that's important for, you know, performance as well, not least because of when you're strapped into a race car, you're strapped in extremely tightly. And if you have your overalls bunching in different places or grabbing in different places, it's very uncomfortable. I mean, to some extent, it's offset by the fact that overalls are extremely individual. And, you know, my overalls have always been, since I went professional, tailor-made around my own measurements. And, you know, that can help a lot. But it is a consideration, and particularly at sort of grassroots, amateur level, people who are buying off-the-shelf stuff, you know, it can make a big difference. And then I think the other element that's kind of being looked at more recently, and it's something that actually affects me as having, you know, a body that's very atypical, I would say. You know, I'm much shorter than the average height for a man. I'm much smaller than, you know, the average man, and so on. Race cars are also designed for typical men's bodies. Because again, race car manufacturers want to sell to the biggest possible audience. GT cars are based on the road models that are supercars, which are designed for their target audience. And it really does limit your performance if, you know, you're in a seat and a structure around you that's not designed for you. So without getting too technical, if you're racing a car and you have to be lifted up in the seat in order to simply see over the bodywork, you're already losing performance by having a higher center of gravity than if you were able to sit lower in the car. You get less feel for the car, all of those things. And that's just accepted as part of the sport, primarily, that, you know, I've had to do loads of years where I've just had that sacrifice because that's how the car's built. The only year I didn't have that was when I was works driver for a small manufacturer that actually built a car around me, and I sat in the bare frame before the car was even built. And I said, well, I want the bodywork here, I want the seat here. And no car has ever felt anywhere near as good as that car. It fit me, and it allowed me to perform. And I think motorsport has a huge potential to tailor every aspect because, you know, you can build the car differently, you can build suits differently, and so on. That just, unfortunately, because of commercial realities, hasn't been enough desire to do that. And I think that is an element of, if we want greater female success in the sport, if we want greater success for people of diverse body types, that's something the sport really needs to address.
I'm actually going to change my answer on this, and it's partly because of Emma. I'm going to say, because obviously I was very much below the line in this, my answer, but I'm going to go above the line and literally go and say, what could we do here? So in terms of, like, so obviously my work is with the transgender and non-binary community normally. So let's actually, could we give them a sense of gender euphoria in terms of sportswear. And unfortunately, in terms of the major manufacturers these days, we're only starting to see, for example, in football, the first female football boot's been made specifically for females. So we're obviously very young in this area. But we're looking at, so 0.02% of the population in the UK at the moment. So you're talking about 600,000-ish people that do not have, don't have an atypical male body, they don't have an atypical female body, they have somewhere in between. So if you're looking at transmasculine hormone treatment, it changes the body obviously for a masculinization, and obviously transfeminine, it changes the body for obviously feminizing, but it doesn't quite reach the full scale of an atypical female. So could sports, and could the sports industry, for example, we heard from Castor yesterday, could we heard from, smaller businesses like Fowdy's, for example, could they actually start designing, transgender-specific sportswear? And, if you think about in terms of, that population itself, they have already so much barriers to participation in sport, and clothing is one of them. And in the way that I think about it is, if you look good, you feel good, and you perform better. So I think it's a massive, massive gap in the industry, and there's 600,000 people there begging for it. So any sports governing, or any sports manufacturers here that thinking about a business idea, there's your answer.
Khadija.
I'm going to ask you guys, is there a certain kit that we should wear for any sports? Are we able to wear anything that we want to wear whilst we're playing sport? These are the sort of questions that we need to ask ourselves. And as an advocate for Muslim women and girls who dress like me, we should be able to wear what we want, what we're comfortable in when we're doing certain sports, as long as we're not injuring anyone or harming anyone else. I cycle regularly, and I've had a lot of hate because of the way I look, the way I dress. And I do just go out looking like I am right now whilst I'm on my cycle. Bang traffic time, and I will get horned at, and I will get everything out. But is it because of the way I look? Why? Why are we going through this in 2025? There shouldn't be this expectation that we need to look or dress a certain way to play certain sports. Everybody should be given that option, that choice to wear what they want. And I'm going to steal a tagline from the Sweaty Betty Foundation, who have very, very recently just starts in the changing rooms. Young girls are facing challenges in the changing rooms in schools because there's a stigma that they need to look a certain way whilst they're playing sport, and it shouldn't be like that. At KRIMMZ, we advocate and we allow the women and the girls to, as long as they're comfortable, to look and dress the way they want whilst they're playing any sport, and that's how it should be. Muslim women and girls, they want a sense of modesty, wearing sports hijabs, they want to wear certain things, and that's fine. As long as they're okay and that's what they want, for them to become physically active, we should allow that. And I say that openly and very proudly that let's not make clothing a barrier for them not to participate in sport.
Yeah, so body confidence obviously is deeply linked to participation and performance. And we want athletes to feel empowered and comfortable in their kit without compromising efficiency and performance. So what can we expect, or what would we like to ask of regulators, of teams and clubs who influence kit, and of manufacturers to improve that and to be more inclusive, to make sure it's more mainstream, to accept that there are different needs, but you still have some level of, it looks like a kit, a uniform, and we can see that you're from a certain sport or a certain club?
I feel that, like I said, as long as they're not harming anybody and they're not, they're okay within themselves, and it's not going to, obstruct them in doing certain elements of the sports. As long as they feel safe and they're comfortable in what they're wearing, they should be allowed to wear what they want. Like I said, Muslim women and girls, they want to have that sense of modesty, long sleeve tops or long trousers, sports hijab, because that's what their faith requires them to do, in certain surroundings and backgrounds. So as long as them elements are covered, I think there shouldn't be this. They have to have a certain level of, like for example, tennis. Wearing mini skirts, it's not going to happen. You're not going to get any Muslim women playing tennis, if that's what they need to wear.
Yeah, there's also, I mean, Wimbledon's just about to start,
Yeah.
and the issue of only wearing white, that's going to be really difficult for female athletes. Thoughts on what our expectations or asks of regulators, clubs, manufacturers?
I think, from my point of view, there's been a couple of examples recently. I can't remember, was it a volleyball team or was it a hockey team, or I can't remember what specific sport it was. Both, yeah, it was both. There you go. So I've not imagined it. Basically, where girls' teams were having to forfeit games because they were wearing different uniforms or that sort of stuff. And I think that's where we have to get rid of. In terms of society these days, we shouldn't be putting people in, we expect you to wear skirts, we expect you to do this, we expect you to do that. Because obviously we want the sport to do the talking, and we want the athlete's performance to do the talking, and I think that's massively important. And again, secondly, again, looking at in terms of the recent sort of policies for obviously transgender women in sport, there was an example of in the United States, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, was used as a form of protest because a transgender female swimmer obviously was banned from the female category, was swimming in the male category and basically wore the male uniform, and then was disqualified because she was showing breasts. And that's, where are we here? As you say, we're in 2025, and why does a sports uniform govern what someone can do? And again, it just takes away from the spectacle or the sport, and really, that's really what we're after here. We're after, I want the performance to be, if someone wins, I want to be talking about them. I don't want to be talking about what they're wearing. And that's where we should be in sports performance today.
I think from a manufacturer side, there's a point around language as well, which is something we've talked about with race teams. It's something I found when I was fencing as well. So in fencing, you wear the same protective gear, whether you're, in men's fencing or women's fencing. Obviously, there are aspects of, if you're going to wear a chest protector under, that's going to be different. But, the fundamental uniform is the same. But, it's marketed as men's jacket, men's breeches, women's breeches. In motorsport team kits, team wear, most people aren't the driver in a team, they're wearing team wear. And it's all, men's kit, women's kit. And I think, something we've been looking at with the teams we work with is moving away from that language a little bit and concentrating more on sort of centering, descriptions of the items and body types and so on, rather than kind of, putting everything into a gendered language that doesn't necessarily need to be in a gendered language. Because as I say, from my example, I'm very different from a typical male body. And I think that's something that, could be borne in mind, but also is very important to people's sense of identity and self. For full disclosure, I'm wearing something that would be described as a women's blazer, but it fits me a lot better than something from the other side of the shop. But, why should I feel uncomfortable going into that side of the shop to get something that fits me perfectly? It's the same with athletes' clothing. I think in terms of what regulators can do, there's obviously sensitivity to different people's requirements, opening up regulations where they're overly restrictive and they don't need to be for any practical purpose. And I think possibly one of the issues I raised before was around funding and so on. And I think, while sports are making kind of inclusion grants and thinking about inclusion, they should be thinking about this area too and incentivizing manufacturers to make more inclusive options for people. And perhaps some of the money from that can come from, if you're going to, and I believe in this as a principle in general, if you're going to sponsor a sport, to sponsor a governing body, sponsor a team kit, some of that money should be put towards making sure there's a balance of inclusion there. You're not just sponsoring the men's team, you're sponsoring the entire club, the entire sport. And I think that could be a way of, if someone wants to be a big shirt kit sponsor for the men's team or whatever, the governing body should be saying, well, we're going to use this money to make sure we're putting out more inclusive options as well.
Yeah, some great thoughts there. I wanted to move on to talk about broader inclusion in terms of creating an environment that from the grassroots level up makes everybody feel that the sport's for them and they can get into it. Cultural and religious inclusion, including considerations around religious holidays, modesty, is vital to making sure that people feel that they can participate in a sport rather than it's not for them. So have we seen examples of where culturally inclusive policies have helped increase participation from underrepresented groups, and what can we learn from those?
I could talk forever on this topic.
Go for it.
My one ask from the NGBs and the governing bodies is that take into consideration, religious times, fasting, Ramadan, Eid celebrations, and other of the calendar of the important dates, and just be mindful of your athletes and those that are at grassroots, the teams that are playing, and just, we see in like the football where, you see football players, breaking their fast on the pitch, and that's really good that they do that, but let's just take some time to think about, how these athletes are feeling, and looking after their, with their physical health, their spiritual health as well, and their mental well-being. So it all plays a big part, having these provisions in place, for these, individuals, from different religions, and not just Muslim people. It could be from people from all faiths and all backgrounds. Really do think about it and ask the question. If you're unsure about anything, just ask. Honestly, no one's going to say it's a silly question, or how do we tackle this, or how do we approach this. We're more than happy. I've had the ECB come to me and ask, what kind of guidance can we give to our our players, and and our staff members as well. Like, how can we support them in certain times of the year. So it's just about educating ourselves, educating others, and to support those who are on the playing field.
Yeah, I'll echo that, because part of our work at UEFA is something that we really look into that in terms of, religious and cultural diversity. I'll use a specific, example of Ramadan is definitely one of them. We've certainly included that more in our sort of nutritional support to the players now, in terms of, coaching loads and all that sort of stuff, because again, it's not ideal to be going and doing, ridiculous training when you're on an empty stomach. Literally, because, coach used to be a case of coaches would see a lack of performance on your GPS or anything like that, and you'd be saying, well, what's, push harder, we need more from you. But now there's actually a sort of understanding of, well, this is actually what you're going through, this is what you need. From a nutritional standpoint as well, we're now like working at, in terms of when they're breaking their fast, what's the optimal nutrition we can use to get them to, where we need them to be at that sort of point. And even outside of Ramadan, we're looking at, different, religions, and, in terms of, we're asking athletes to go and sleep for, 8 to 10 hours, but some people need to get up at certain times, to pray in the morning, especially, like, for example, the Turks and all these sort of people. So generally from their point of view, so we're like, and we actually give them another opportunity, sometimes during the afternoons, a little break to go and, catch up on that sleep deficit. It's something that we're generally working on at UEFA, and we're definitely trying, to bring that sort of thing coming in, because the more understanding, the better performance that you're going to get from the players.
How about in motorsports?
Yeah, I don't have an enormous amount to add on the specific point, other than obviously, there's the points that have already been made around competition timing and so on. In fencing, there was an example of one of the very best fencers in Britain who was fasting for Ramadan during the British Senior Championships, and it was a big issue for them in terms of Olympic selection. They were so incredible that they still managed to medal and get their selection, but it was something they shouldn't have had to have gone through. I think maybe the other point I'd make around this kind of cultural sensitivity of moments of religious significance is obviously sports teams are now communicating on, rightly, a broad range of inclusion topics. And I think, particularly we've worked with a Formula One team that does put out a lot of messaging around different religious festivals for a number of faiths. And I think there is a sensitivity from all sides on, when are we asking clubs, athletes to kind of talk about this messaging? And it is possible to support all strands of inclusion. It just needs some, proper thought about how we articulate that at different moments in order to reach different communities in an authentic way. It has to be backed up by authentic beliefs, but, so that we're not kind of seen as putting out competing messaging in any way, but making sure we are addressing the broad diversity of fans and participants the sport will have.
So we've touched on gender identity and trans inclusion in sports. I'm interested in what are the most significant barriers to trans and non-binary athletes in trying to compete at elite level or enter sports at the grassroots level, and how can we ensure that debates around fairness don't dehumanise or marginalise transgender athletes? Do we want to look at open categories? Does that help? Does that make things worse? What are the policy changes that we're seeing that are helping or that we might hope to see? And obviously this is very different in different sports.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, because obviously we're talking about transgender inclusion, but we're actually more talking about transgender exclusion, especially in terms of the transgender female side of things these days. And as I said, unfortunately, I stand before you as one of the 20-odd banned footballers at the moment. So, hello. So obviously, since the Supreme Court ruling, most sports are now moving to exclude transgender women from the female category. I have someone who's played in women's football for the past 10 years, never had any issues. I might be Scottish, but I represented England, which my family nearly disowned me for. So, like, it's the biggest barrier to that is, like, for example, of myself, is I no longer have access to the support networks and, you know, the teams and, you know, the competition that I had before. But this is, you know, someone from me who's had a 10-year career in football, you know, so I've got these connections, I've got these friends, that I've had the opportunity. The saddest thing is for the ones that are just starting. And I just want to give you a story of a little 17-year-old who actually played her first season. So 17-year-old wee trans girl. Basically, we did some work with our football team. And so we asked our football team, just, you know, asking questions, you know, what do you want to do in football? What do you do in football? They're like, I want to be a lioness. I want to win the World Cup. I want to do this. I want to do that. And we spoke to, let's just call her Laura at the moment. We spoke to Laura, and Laura's dream was, I just want to play football with my mates. And, you know, because of these exclusionary policies, that's, you know, she can't do that. You know, apart from that, so, again, already people don't feel like, you know, sports are for them, you know, that everyone's moving against, especially transgender women. Obviously, transgender men are very, very valid in this conversation, but we are at a women's conference, so I'll try and keep it that way. And also, one of the biggest barriers that, you know, through my research and through everything else I've seen is gender-affirming hormone treatment is a performance-reducing therapy. And it's quite considerably, and you hear this all the time about, you know, all the settled science, the settled science, the settled science. If I told you that there has only ever been, in academic literature at the moment, there's only ever been 4 studies that have studied trans athletes, I've done 2 of them. And so, and of those 4 studies, there's only been 36 athletes worldwide studied, and 2 of those studies were case studies of 1 athlete. So it's a very, very, very young area of conversation, a very young topic of where we're going. And the thing for me is, one of the biggest barriers is when we're moving to these exclusionary policies, obviously my athlete pool for my studies is getting less and less and less and less. So right now I'm thinking we're never going to have the answers that we need. We're not going to have the answers to support these people. Like, for example, at UEFA, we were planning to do a big, you know, injury audit study on transgender women and transgender men in football this year, basically because we're like, well, actually, do they get injured more? Like, we're actually looking after the athlete. But now we can't do that because, you know, they're banned by, you know, sports governing bodies in the UK. And it's you know, that's the barriers we're now getting to this, is, you know, we're moving to a place where actually especially trans women and transgender females are being excluded, and that's having a knock-on effect on cisgender women and cisgender girls as well, because anyone who is now too masculine, too muscular, too anything, and we're already seeing examples of this in football. There was a friendly cancelled last night because a girl was too masculine. Cisgender girl, I think she's 18, 19 years old, and the team refused to play against her because they thought she was trans. And that's where we're at now. We're now at a place where we're getting suspicion, we're now getting, you know, hate, exclusion. And this is where, you know, this Supreme Court ruling was supposed to, you know, provide clarity, and it's provided the polar opposite.
Yeah, so, I mean, thank you, that was very powerful. It got me a bit emotional hearing that example at the end. I think, you know, motorsport is a bit different from a sport like football in some ways, and a lot of other sports, in that we're having a slightly different conversation around this because, you know, obviously the approach to this has to be to some extent sport specific. It's got to be dependent on, you know, studies of performance factors and so on. But in motorsport, we are essentially looking at a cultural question rather than so much a physical question, because I think, it's beyond doubt that, women do have, cisgender women absolutely have the physical capacity to match, cisgender men in a race car. There's a point of strength past which it doesn't make any difference, I think is what I'm trying to say, and again, that's not just across, gender necessarily. I was teammates with Sir Chris Hoy when I was doing that season where I won the European Championship in the prototypes. We were driving identical cars by the same manufacturer. We shared a garage. It was one of the biggest privileges of my life. I've got to say, he is even better in person than you'd imagine him to be. He's a real hero, and I'm very sad for the condition that he's currently in. But he's facing it brilliantly. But where I'm building towards is our brake pedal forces. So we would, do tests of like your peak brake pressure that you could put into the car. He is a multiple world Olympic champion athlete with thighs that are enormous, and he's still incredibly strong even right now, and he could put way more braking force in than I could. I would sit in the car, brace myself, hit the pedal, I'd reach about 60 psi. He was braking the meter, which only went up to 100 psi. But you don't need 100 psi when you're on the track, you need 60. There's a point of strength past which makes no difference. So we're not really talking about a performance advantage question in motorsport. That's a level that, cis female athletes can attain. So this is not really a performance question. It is a cultural question. And I think it is important to note that this isn't just for trans women. One of the things that made it come up in motorsport was Racing Pride had an interaction with the Girls on Track community, which is to promote, obviously, young women and girls into motorsport. And one of the people within that community who's been massively successful, who's now an ambassador for Racing Pride, has worked in series across the world, they were a non-binary person, assigned female at birth, but they felt uncomfortable with the fact that all the language was about womanhood and female identities, and they felt a little excluded by that. And so they approached us and said, can you talk to Motorsport UK about this? I feel a bit uncomfortable in the movement that's meant to sort of support me, even though, they were excelling in their career. And so we spoke to Motorsport UK and we changed the language just slightly, just subtly. It's still Girls on Track. It's still about women in motorsport. But there's a thing that says, this is open, essentially, I forget exactly what wording we used, but this is open to people who feel that they belong here. That this is something that is deliberately inclusive. And it has not led to a load of men joining Girls on Track. That has not happened. But what has happened is that non-binary person feels so much more comfortable in that space now, and gender fluid people feel that they can go into that space, and trans women absolutely feel more welcome in that space. And I think motorsport's also in an interesting position where it has never really had gendered categories before. The assumption has always been that all the categories are all gender. Some people ridiculously don't know that women could race in Formula One just because they haven't for decades, but they are eligible. It's a cultural question. We're not getting enough female drivers in, etc. There's a whole, thing that we could say about that. But in order to encourage that greater participation, we've now started initiatives like F1 Academy, which is for all women, which is a really important step. But my fear is we need to have that conversation in a way that doesn't create gendered issues that we didn't have before for trans and non-binary people. One thing I was really pleased with was with W Series, we spoke to the organisers and they adopted a policy that explicitly said trans women are eligible for this category. Again, did they get a flood of trans women applying? No. But it was important, and it showed that we're not creating exclusion where we didn't have it before. And the final thing, and I'm conscious of time, I'm sorry, is I was part of Motorsport UK launching the first ever trans inclusion policy in world motorsport. It was a brilliantly inclusive policy. It said that gender would be entirely self-declared, self-defined, that would be respected in all aspects of licensing and eligibility for all categories. And we were very, very proud to launch that in 2023. What I would say is that was very powerful for the community. But how you nurture those policies is also really important, how you put them into practice. Without going into boring details, Motorsport UK has changed its way you apply for licenses now, and there were big issues around trying to put in a multi-sport system that forced you to select a binary gender identity within it. In fact, the question was so badly phrased, it was, so you had to select a binary gender identity, and then is your gender the same as your sex assigned at birth? We did not want that information. but the system forced it to be collected. And that caused a big problem in implementing this inclusive policy. So having the policy is great, but it's also how you implement it and continuing to push on it and continuing to believe in it. Otherwise, you just look inauthentic.
So, being aware of time, I want to come on to grassroots sports. Before I do, I want to acknowledge we had a question, but I don't think it's a question we can answer, but it's a great point that I'm going to read out, and maybe somebody else in the room could answer it, from Kate Kent. As an inclusive sportswear designer with 25 years of experience, how can I overcome the development barriers posed by factories that won't take on small projects due to costs, and brands historically run by male leadership that resist innovation and inclusivity? So that is a great point. I don't think that we could answer that particularly, but somebody in the room might want to have that conversation with us and with Kate during the networking break. Bringing it back to grassroots, I am part of a local LGBT running club, and one of our weekly runs is based from a sports centre that used to have gender-neutral, accessible toilet and shower that anyone could use, whether it was because they didn't want to use gender toilets or they just wanted their own space for modesty reasons. They've taken those away, so they've created exclusion where it wasn't before. So I wanted to come to Khadija about getting people involved in grassroots sports. How do grassroots sports clubs and groups differ in their approach to inclusion? And how can they play a role in shaping the future of policy and regulation?
I think there needs to be an understanding of the needs that especially Muslim women and girls face. There's an element of privacy that they want. So to have a space where it's a safe space, but it's a private space for them, where they can dress how they want, play sport how they want, meet people who they want. There needs to be certain provisions in place for them. So like court hire, indoor. You may not get as many Muslim women and girls, going to a run club that's outdoor, but as long as there's an indoor facility, you will. I'm not saying you won't, but majority of the time you may not. And then there needs to be an element of an option for prayer as well. So that the 3 Ps. So provision, prayer, privacy. All these things can be implemented. You will get participation within sport and within a variety of sports as well.
Got about a minute each to tell us your thoughts.
Yeah, so
grassroots,
grassroots sports. So I will wrap through it in a minute, hopefully. I think we need to appreciate what grassroots sports is for. And as soon as we are understanding what grassroots sports is for, then we can move forward in terms of, inclusion policies. Grassroots is about finding community. It's about finding, belonging. It's about making a bigger network. It's, if you win your League Cup at step 7 in English football, like, oh my God, you're not a professional footballer, that sort of stuff. Like, you've done it with your mates, and that's the sort of thing. Like, for example, a lot of people don't know in terms of the transgender, or what it used to be, it's now not, but WSL, so the Women's Super League, and obviously WSL 2, which is now the Women's Championship, they were governed by UEFA. So even if I was good enough, I was never, the FA were never responsible for me to go up into those divisions. So there was already that borderline of, where grassroots sport and where, professional sport started, and I had to go through a different process. But that's the only thing I will say in terms of going forward is I think we need to realise that we are at the moment creating severe harm for people, because we are, as I said, what grassroots sports for, we're taking that away from people. And I think that's going to, be detrimental to mental health, physical activity, all these sort of things. And these are all comorbidities for, poor health going forward. So we just need to realise we're creating harm.
Yeah, I'd echo that point that you've got to think about why are we having these competitions. One of the most intelligent points I heard the previous time I was on a panel discussing this was from a KC sat next to me who said, sport actually is not about fairness. Sport is about deciding what values you want to reward and who you want to win. That's how you write sporting regulations. Do you decide you want the strongest person to win? Do you decide you want the cleanest athlete to win? Do you decide you want the athlete who trains the hardest, etc.? What is sport for? That's how you write the regulations. You're deciding what virtues, what values, etc. you want to reward in the athletes. And when you're looking at grassroots sport, the most important thing is inclusion and giving everyone a chance. It's more important than any other consideration, really, because we need to get as many people into sport as possible and as many people thriving as possible. My other reflection on that would be sometimes over-regulation can be a barrier here. Do we need to regulate these competitions quite as tightly as, professional competitions where there's real prize money to be won? And my very quick example of that, with 10 seconds left, is the varsity Oxford-Cambridge fencing match allowed a trans woman to fence in the women's match because both teams were completely happy with that, and it completely went with everyone's values to do that. But in the Universities Championship, the British University Championship, that same athlete couldn't compete even between those same two teams because the governing body wouldn't allow it to happen, even though every athlete was the same and everyone there thought it was the right thing to do. So sometimes governing bodies can get a little too involved at different levels in this.
Agreed. I thought 45 minutes was a long time for a panel, but there's loads of points that we had that we haven't got a chance to get to. But do come and talk to us at the break if you want to delve into any of those issues. And thanks for listening. Thank you to my panelists.
Thank you.